The town of Bitter Creek had already decided she would die that morning. She was 23 years old. Her father had been murdered. The sheriff would not look at her. The doctor had locked his door. And Josiah Blackwood was walking toward her across the frozen mud with a smile that did not reach his eyes. She closed her eyes, and then very far away she heard it, the slow, heavy crunch of hooves on frozen mud. 3 riders coming down the mountain. Not hurrying, not afraid. The sound a mountain makes when it has decided to move. This is the story of how 3 men kept a promise made in the blood of Antietam 23 years before a woman named Abigail Prescott was ever born into trouble. The town of Bitter Creek had already decided she would die that morning. They had decided it the night before when Josiah Blackwood sat in the back room of his bank with a glass of rye whiskey and a ledger full of forged signatures, and they had confirmed it at dawn when Sheriff Elias Thornton polished the badge he no longer deserved and looked the other way. By the time the sun climbed over the ragged Wyoming peaks and threw its cold October light across the main street, every merchant, every wife, every drunk on the boardwalk knew what was coming, and not a single one of them planned to stop it. Her name was Abigail Prescott. She was 23 years old. She was the daughter of a dead man, and she was about to bleed. She did not know any of this yet. She was sitting in a coach that smelled of cheap tobacco and horse sweat, her gloved hands folded in her lap, her back held straight the way her mother had taught her when she was a little girl in Boston. She was watching the autumn grass of the high plains roll past the window in great waves of copper and gold, and she was thinking for the first time in 6 months that perhaps she had done the right thing. In the pocket over her heart, she carried 3 things. A cameo brooch that had belonged to her mother, Cordelia Prescott, dead these 12 years from consumption. A small leather-bound Bible with her father's handwriting pressed between the pages of the Book of Ruth, and a letter. The letter was folded and refolded so many times that the creases had turned gray. It was short the way a plain-spoken man writes a letter when he is not used to writing them, and every time she read it, she felt the same thing she had felt in the narrow parlor of her dead father's house in Boston. She felt a door opening. She felt a hand being offered. "Miss Prescott, I am a friend of your father. If you come, you will have a home. I do not promise love, but I promise to protect you. The train runs to Cheyenne, the stage from there to Bitter Creek. I will meet you, S. McCready." She had read the letter so many times that she knew its weight in her fingers. She had read it on the train out of Boston while the red brick buildings of her childhood shrank into the distance, and she understood calmly and clearly that she would never see them again. She had read it in the station at Chicago while a man tried to sell her a patent medicine for loneliness. She had read it in Omaha, in North Platte, and Cheyenne. And now, with the last miles of the stage road unspooling behind her and the mountains rising like the walls of a cathedral ahead, she folded the letter one more time and pressed her fingers to the paper, as if she could feel the man who had written it on the other side. She did not hear the driver mutter the first time. She thought it was the wind. The second time she heard him plain. He was leaning forward on the box with his hat pulled low, and he was speaking to his team of 4 gray mares, but he was saying it loud enough for her to catch. "Mountain folk don't come down no more, and flatland folk don't go up." She opened the small window at the front of the coach and lifted her voice above the rattle of the traces. "Excuse me, sir, did you say something?" He did not look back. His jaw worked under a week of gray stubble. "I said, ma'am, that you are going to a town where nobody is going to help you. That is what I said. And I wish to God you had told me your business before I took your $2 and put you on this coach." "Who am I meeting?" she said. He laughed once. It was not a happy sound. "The McCready brothers, I reckon." She felt something small and cold turn over inside her chest. "Yes." "Then I hope, ma'am," he said, "that they are alive when you get there, because Josiah Blackwood has a price on their heads, and they ain't been down the mountain in 3 weeks, and there are men in Bitter Creek who will pay good coin to know you have arrived." She closed the window. She sat back. She pressed the letter against her chest, and she made her lungs go in and out the way her father had taught her when she was a little girl and the world was too large. Breathe in, hold, breathe out. Her father had been a banker in Boston, a kind man, a quiet man, a veteran of a war he would not speak of. 6 months ago, he had left for a business trip to Wyoming Territory on a matter he told her that he could not speak of until he returned. He had not returned. 3 weeks later, word had come by telegram to his lawyer in Boston that William Prescott had been found at the bottom of a ravine near Cheyenne with a hole in the back of his skull that did not come from any rock. The coroner had called it a robbery. The men who called on her at the house afterward, the men in black coats with papers that said her father owed $50,000 to banks he had never done business with, had not called it anything at all. They had simply taken the house and the furniture and the piano her mother had brought from Vienna. And when Abigail had gone through the last drawer of her father's desk with shaking hands, she had found the bundle of letters from a man named Silas McCready from a mountain in Wyoming. The last letter from her father had been unsent. Silas, it read, son of Thomas, who carried me out of the sunken road at Antietam when I was bleeding into the dust and there was no one else. Blackwood has taken more than money from me. He has taken my name. If anything happens to me, find my daughter Abigail. She has no one else. She knows nothing of this. Protect her as your father protected me. TP. She had sat on the floor of that empty house with the letter in her lap, and she had made a decision. She had written to Silas McCready. 2 weeks later, his answer had come. And now the coach was slowing, and the driver was coughing into his fist, and the gray mares were stamping in the cold, and the town of Bitter Creek was rising out of the prairie like a row of rotten teeth. She stepped down into the mud. The mud was frozen on top and soft underneath, and it grabbed at the hem of her navy blue traveling dress. She had the carpet bag in one hand, and she was looking for a face, any face that might belong to a man named Silas. The driver did not wait. He threw her trunk down into the street with a sound like a coffin being dropped. He climbed back up on the box without a word. He snapped the reins and the coach rolled away, and the gray mare's hooves threw up small black stars of mud that flecked across her skirt, and she did not even notice. The street was empty. No, not empty. That was the wrong word. The street was full. It was full of the backs of people. A woman in a gingham apron was pulling her two small children into a general store, and she was turning the brass key in the lock with hands that shook. A man in a leather apron was stepping off the boardwalk of the blacksmith shop and walking quickly in the other direction. A boy who had been sitting on a wooden crate with a shoe brush in his hand was standing up, and he was watching her, and his eyes were the eyes of a boy who has been told not to speak to a ghost. She took a breath. She set the carpet bag down beside the trunk. She straightened her shoulders because her mother had always said that a Prescott woman keeps her shoulders straight no matter what, and she walked toward the boy. "Excuse me," she said. "My name is Abigail Prescott. I am looking for a man named Silas McCready." The boy's face did something complicated. He looked at her, and then he looked past her, and then he looked down at his shoes. "Ma'am," he whispered, and his voice was the voice of a child who is about to cry, "you ought to get back on that coach." "It has gone," she said gently. "Then get on the next one." Friton. He opened his mouth. He closed it again. He looked over her shoulder a second time, and his whole small body went stiff the way a rabbit goes stiff when a hawk crosses the sun. Abigail turned. A man was walking toward her from the far end of the street. He was not a large man. He was of medium height, and he was dressed in a black broadcloth suit that had been brushed that morning, and he wore a gold watch chain across a flat stomach, and his face was smooth and pleasant, and his hair was combed flat against his skull with some kind of oil that caught the cold sunlight. He was smiling. The smile did not reach his eyes, and his eyes were the color of slate after rain. Behind him, at a distance of perhaps 10 paces, walked another man. The other man was taller and wider, and he had a brutal stamp of a face, a mouth that had been broken and healed wrong, and a scar that ran from the corner of one eye down into the collar of a rough canvas coat. There was a Winchester rifle cradled in his arms. His name, though Abigail did not know it yet, was Cole Harding. He did not smile at all. The first man stopped 5 feet from her and removed his hat. The gesture was perfect. A dancing master could not have done it better. My dear Miss Prescott, he said. His voice was warm, warm as buttered bread, warm as a banked fire on a December night. You must forgive this dreadful welcome. I would have met you at the stage myself if I had known the hour. My name is Josiah Blackwood. I own the bank here and the hotel, and I am afraid to say a certain portion of the sorrow that has come to this town. Sir, said Abigail. She heard her own voice, and it sounded very far away, like a voice speaking underwater. I am here to meet Mr. Silas McCready. Blackwood's face did something delicate and sad. Ah, he said. Yes, of course you are. Miss Prescott, you are not the first young woman to arrive in this territory believing a letter, and you will not, I fear, be the last. Come, let me walk you to the hotel. We must get you out of this cold. I will explain. She did not move. Mr. Blackwood, she said, I would like to know where Mr. McCready is. Blackwood's smile remained. His eyes did not. Miss Prescott, he said, Silas McCready is a murderer. He killed 3 men in this street last spring. He lives on a mountain 40 miles from here, and he has not been seen in this town for nearly a month. I am very sorry. But the man who wrote you that letter, whatever he may have promised, is not a man you want to find. That is a lie. She did not mean to say it. The words came out of her before she could decide whether to say them, and once they were out, she could not put them back. She watched Blackwood's face, and she saw for half of a second something cross it that was not warm at all. Then the warmth returned. You are tired, he said, and you have been frightened. Come, we will talk at the hotel. My clerk will have your trunk sent up. You will have a hot bath and a hot supper, and we will see what can be done. There is, I must tell you, a small matter concerning your father, a debt he left at my bank. But we will not trouble ourselves with that tonight. Tonight you will rest. My father said Abigail did not owe your bank. $50,000, Miss Prescott. I have the papers. And she felt it then. The cold thing in her chest that had turned over in the coach. It turned again because Josiah Blackwood had just told her the exact sum that the men in black coats in Boston had come to her father's house to collect. A sum that was not written on any headstone. A sum that no one in this territory should have known. Unless. She did not let her face move. She had grown up the daughter of a banker. She knew how to keep a face. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood, she said. I will accept the hotel for tonight. I am quite tired. Of course you are, he said. Cole, the trunk. The big man stepped forward without a word and lifted her trunk onto his shoulder as if it weighed nothing. He did not look at her. He walked past her, and he left behind a smell she would remember for the rest of her life, a smell of wet wool and sour sweat and something else underneath. Blackwood offered her his arm. She did not take it. She walked beside him with her carpet bag in her hand and her eyes on the boardwalk, and she heard as they passed the general store the sound of the key turning again in the lock. The woman in the gingham apron had taken one look at Josiah Blackwood, walking a strange woman down her street, and she had locked her own children away from what was about to happen. Abigail understood then that she was in terrible trouble. She did not show it. The hotel was called the Blackwood Arms. Of course it was. The lobby was cold and smelled of cigar smoke, and the clerk behind the desk would not meet her eyes. Blackwood saw her to the foot of the stairs and bowed over her hand and told her that supper would be brought to her room in an hour. He smiled the warm smile. He told her to rest. He told her that tomorrow in the clear light of morning they would sort everything out and she would see that there was no cause for alarm. Her room was on the second floor. It had a narrow bed and a washstand and a window that looked out on the main street. Her trunk sat at the foot of the bed where Cole had dropped it. The key was in the door on the inside, and she turned it twice. Then she sat on the edge of the bed with her carpet bag in her lap, and she waited for her hands to stop shaking. They did not stop for a long time. The supper came. She ate what she could of it and left the rest. She did not undress. She did not lie down. She sat in the wooden chair by the window with her mother's shawl around her shoulders, and she watched the cold stars come out over the Wyoming plain, and she tried to make a plan. There was no plan. She had a carpet bag and a Bible and a cameo brooch and $42 sewn into the hem of her petticoat. She was in a hotel owned by the man who had almost certainly murdered her father, in a town that had already turned its back on her, and somewhere up on a mountain she could not see in the dark, there was a man who had written her a letter, and that man had not come. She did not cry. Prescott women did not cry where anyone could see them. Near 10 o'clock, something slid under her door. It was a small square of paper folded once. She heard no footsteps. She heard no voice. She rose slowly and she crossed the room and she picked it up. The handwriting was hurried. The ink had bled in places as if the hand that wrote it had been shaking too. Blackwood killed your father. Do not sign anything. Get to the mountain before sunrise. A friend. She read it twice, then she held it to the candle until it burned. She sat down on the bed and she put her hand over her mouth, and for a small moment, a small, unwitnessed moment, she did cry. She cried for her father who had carried a man out of Antietam with a bullet in his leg and had come home and married her mother and had taught her the names of the constellations. She cried for her mother. She cried for the piano that had been sold in Boston. She cried because she was 23 years old and she had nothing in the world but the clothes on her back and a Bible and a brooch. And somewhere on a cold mountain, there was a stranger who had promised to protect her, and she had to somehow find a way to him before morning without being seen. She did not find a way because at 3 minutes past 6 o'clock in the morning, before the sun was up and while the street was still full of the blue light that comes before dawn, Cole Harding kicked her door in. He did not knock. The wood of the frame splintered around the iron of the lock, and the door crashed back against the wall, and he was inside the room in 2 long strides. Abigail had slept for perhaps an hour in the chair. She came up out of the chair with a scream that did not reach her throat because Cole's hand was already over her mouth. He smelled of sour sweat and whiskey and the other thing underneath. He dragged her by the hair out of the chair and across the floor, and she could not get her feet under her, and the carpet bag fell and the Bible spilled out of it and skidded under the bed. Cole Harding did not speak. He pulled her down the narrow hotel stairs by the wrist, and her ankle turned on the 3rd step, and a line of pain shot up into her hip, and still he did not slow. The clerk was not behind the desk. The lobby was empty. The front doors of the Blackwood Arms stood open on a gray, cold morning, and Josiah Blackwood was waiting on the boardwalk with 3 other men she had not seen before, and the smile was gone from his face now. "Good morning, Miss Prescott," he said. He nodded once to Cole. Cole let go of her hair and he shoved her. Abigail pitched forward off the boardwalk and landed on her hands and knees in the frozen mud of the street. The mud was hard as stone on top, and it tore the palms of her hands. She felt the skin open. She tasted something metallic and understood a second later that her lip was bleeding. She tried to stand. "Stay down, Miss Prescott," said Blackwood. "There is going to be a small transaction between us this morning, and it will be easier if you stay down." She put her shoulders back. It was the last thing her mother had taught her. A Prescott woman keeps her shoulders back. She got her feet under her. She stood up in the middle of the street in Bitter Creek with the blood on her lip and the mud on her hands and her hair falling out of its pins, and she said in a voice that did not belong to a frightened girl, but to a woman who had just understood exactly what she was dealing with, "Say to me what you came here to say." Blackwood blinked. It was only a small thing, a fraction of a second, but she saw it and he saw that she had seen it, and his face tightened. "Your father," he said, "stole $50,000 from this bank before he died. I have the papers. I have witnesses. I have the signature of a federal clerk in Cheyenne. In the eyes of the United States of America, Miss Prescott, you are the daughter of a thief, in this territory by the simplest application of the law may take from you anything he touched to recover what is owed. You understand me?" She understood him. She understood him exactly. She understood that no such signature existed and that no such witnesses existed and that no such clerk in Cheyenne had ever put his name to her father's papers because her father had never set foot in Wyoming territory. She understood that this was theater. She understood that it was being performed for the benefit of the people she could not see but knew were watching from behind their locked doors. She understood that Josiah Blackwood wanted every merchant, every wife, every drunk in Bitter Creek to see exactly what happened to a person who stood against him. She understood finally that her father had known all of this before he died, and that he had tried to get a letter out to a man named Silas on a mountain, and that the letter had not been finished in time. She understood that her death had been scheduled for this street this morning, in front of these witnesses, not because it made sense, because it made an example. She also understood one more thing. She understood that her father had carried a man out of a place called the Sunken Road, and that the son of that man was alive somewhere within 40 miles of this street, and that if there was any justice in the United States of America in the autumn of 1885, it had better start riding down out of the high timber right now. "Stand up straight, Miss Prescott," said Josiah Blackwood. "The territory is watching. You murdered him." She said it loud. She said it so that the boy with the shoe brush hiding in the alley now could hear it. She said it so that the woman in the gingham apron watching through a gap in her curtains could hear it. She said it so that the cold morning itself could hear it. "You murdered my father." A small murmur went through the watching town, a sound like wind in dry grass. Blackwood's face finally gave up its smile. "Cole," he said. Cole Harding stepped it forward. He swung his boot. The heel took her behind the knee, the way a butcher takes a calf behind the knee, and she went down hard in the mud a second time. Her chin struck the frozen ground. Her teeth closed on her tongue, and she tasted more blood. Cole's hand came down, and he caught her by the collar of the navy blue dress, and he dragged her face toward the muck, and he raised his other fist above her head, and he said, not to her, to the town, the way a hangman speaks to a crowd. "Seems the lady didn't learn her manners." Abigail lifted her eyes. She looked one last time at the faces of the people she had passed on the boardwalk yesterday. She saw Mabel Thornhill, the woman in the gingham apron, pull her children away from the window of the general store. She saw Sheriff Elias Thornton, a weak-chinned man with a badge he had not earned, look down at the mud on his own boots, as if the mud were more interesting than murder. She saw Doc Ambrose Hollister, the town physician, a man who had examined her father's body in the office of a coroner in Cheyenne earlier that year, turn his back completely and walk into his own clinic and close the door. She understood that no one was coming. She closed her eyes. And somewhere very far away in the silence between one breath and the next, there came a sound. It was not a shout. It was not a gunshot. It was the slow, heavy, deliberate crunch of hooves on frozen mud. Many hooves, 3 riders, though she could not yet count them, coming down the street at a walk, not hurrying, not afraid, the sound that a mountain makes when it has decided to move. Cole Harding paused, his fist still raised. She felt the shadow of his body shift above her. She opened her eyes. Up the street, through the thin blue mist of the dawn, 3 men were riding toward her on 3 tall black horses. They did not look like men. They looked like something older than men. They wore heavy buffalo hide coats and fur caps, and their faces were bearded and weathered, and in the cold gray light, their 3 sets of eyes burned amber. They rode abreast, shoulder to shoulder, and the horses did not toss their heads, and the men did not speak. The man in the middle sat the tallest. He had a long rifle across his back and a bowie knife on his hip, and the scar down the side of his face caught the first light of the sun and shone like a line of silver. The man on his right rode with his hands folded on the pommel of his saddle, and there was a stillness about him that was somehow more frightening than a drawn weapon. The man on his left carried 2 revolvers on his hips and a smile on his mouth, and the smile was not friendly. Cole Harding let go of her collar. Abigail did not move. She lay in the mud with her cheek pressed to the cold, and she watched the 3 riders come down the street, and some part of her that was not damaged and was not afraid recognized absolutely that she was looking at the answer to the letter in her pocket. She was looking, she understood, at a promise being kept. The 3 horses stopped 20 feet away. The man in the middle did not dismount at first. He sat in the saddle and he looked down the street, not at Cole, not at Blackwood, but at the whole town, at the locked doors, at the drawn curtains, at the sheriff who would not lift his eyes. It was a long, slow look, the look of a man reading a judgment already written. Then he swung down. His boots hit the mud, and the mud seemed to remember him. He was enormous, 6.5 feet and built of the kind of bone and muscle a man only grows working wood and stone at altitude. And the buffalo coat made his shoulders look wider than a door. He walked to Cole Harding with that slow, deliberate stride, and Cole, who had a Winchester and a knife and a reputation for breaking a man's jaw in 3 places with one blow, took 1 step backward. The big man stopped in front of Cole. He looked down into Cole's face. The amber eyes did not blink. "Enough," he said. It was one word. It was the quietest sound in the street. And it was heard in that instant in every closed house for a block in every direction. Behind him, the rider on his right had dismounted too and was walking toward Abigail. He moved the way a man moves who has set a great many broken bones. He knelt beside her in the mud without hesitation, and he took off his heavy buffalo coat and he draped it over her shoulders, and his voice when it came was deep and warm as a kept fire. "Ma'am," he said, "you are in our hands now. No one is going to touch you again." She turned her face up to him. His eyes were the same amber as his brother's, but softer. He had a careful mouth and a steady mouth, and when he saw the blood on her lip, he said only low, "We will tend to that." Behind them, both the third rider had not dismounted. He sat his horse with the 2 Colts still holstered and the cold smile still on his mouth, and he was watching Blackwood and the 3 hired men on the boardwalk, and he was waiting to see which one of them moved first. None of them did. On the boardwalk, Josiah Blackwood recovered. He took 1 step forward, and he put both hands palms open out in front of him in the gesture of a reasonable man speaking to unreasonable ones. "Mr. McCready," he said, "this is a legal matter. Miss Prescott is a debtor of my bank. She is not under your authority. I will thank you to let my man finish his business and be on his way." The big man, the one in the middle, turned slowly toward Blackwood. "She is my wife," he said. Abigail on the ground stopped breathing. "She is my wife," the big man said again, and he said it so every ear in Bitter Creek could hear it. The paper was filed in Cheyenne 2 weeks ago before a federal judge and a witness. Her name is McCready. You are not owed a penny from her or from her father's estate, and we both know it. Josiah, and if you want to contest that in a federal court in Cheyenne, you are free to try, but you are not going to lay another hand on her in the street. Not today, not ever. Do we understand each other?" Blackwood's face had gone the color of wet paper. He opened his mouth, he closed it again. Abigail watched his eyes cut once to Sheriff Thornton, and she watched the sheriff still not raise his head, and she understood that Josiah Blackwood had just realized publicly and in front of his town that his tame lawman had at that moment ceased to be entirely his. On the ground, the man with the warm voice helped her to her knees. He wiped very gently the mud from her chin with the edge of his sleeve. He bent close to her ear. "Can you stand, ma'am?" "I can," she whispered. "Then we will stand. Slow now. Do not look at him. Look at me." She stood. Her knees were weak and her ankle turned where it had twisted on the stairs, and he took the weight of her against his side without apparent effort. He walked her carefully toward the big man's horse. The third rider, the one with the 2 Colts, had finally swung down and was holding the reins of the big man's black horse, and he was grinning now, a bright, hard grin that had no kindness in it for anyone on that boardwalk. "Easy, Wyatt," the warm-voiced man said under his breath. "I am easy," Ezra said, Wyatt McCready. "I am easy as a summer afternoon. These gentlemen just need to get back inside real slow before I get any easier." No one on the boardwalk moved. The big man, Silas McCready, walked backward to his horse without taking his eyes off Blackwood. Only when his brother had lifted Abigail up into the saddle and settled her there and handed the reins back to him did he for one last second speak again. "Josiah," he said, "the mountain knows what you did to my father. and she knows what you did to hers. You hear me. We are not coming down again for Salt. We are coming down for you." Then he mounted behind her. His arm came around her waist to steady her in the saddle. And though she did not understand why, for the first time since she had stepped off a train in Chicago, Abigail Prescott leaned back against another human being and did not pretend that she was not tired. The three horses turned. They walked not at a gallop, but at the same slow, deliberate walk with which they had come back up the main street of Bitter Creek and out toward the cold blue wall of the Wind River Range rising in the north. No one in the street moved until the three riders were out of rifle shot. At the mouth of the alley, the boy with the shoe brush stepped out into the light. He watched the three horses go. He whispered to no one what would soon be whispered all over the territory. The mountain came down. The mountain came down for her. In the saddle, the cold wind hit Abigail's face, and it found the place where her lip had split, and she flinched and the arm around her waist tightened. Not hard, only sure. The big man's voice was close to her ear. It rumbled in his chest, and she felt it through her back. "You are safe now, Mrs. McCready." She asked one thing. "Your father," she whispered. "At the sunken road, my father. Did he get him out?" She felt the man behind her go still. She felt the horse's hooves strike the frozen ground once, twice, three times. Then very low, so low that only she could hear it over the wind, Silas McCready answered. "He did," he said, "and now I am getting his daughter out. That is the way a promise works, Abigail. That is the only way it works." She closed her eyes. The mountains came up to meet them, cold and blue and enormous. And somewhere inside her chest, for the first time in 6 months, the frozen thing that had been there since the coroner in Boston handed her her father's wedding ring, began very slowly to thaw. The climb took them until noon. The trail did not appear to be a trail at all. It went up through the timber in a series of switchbacks so narrow that at 2 points, Abigail felt the black horse's outside hoof shift loose stone over a drop she could not bring herself to look at. She did not speak. The man behind her did not speak either. His left arm stayed around her waist, solid as a fence rail, and his right hand moved with small, careful adjustments on the reins. And she understood without being told that he had ridden this trail enough times in every weather to know where each of his horse's feet would land before they landed. Ezra McCready, the quiet one, rode ahead. He broke the brush. When a low branch of lodgepole pine hung into the trail, he lifted it aside with the back of his gloved hand and held it until Silas and Abigail had passed, and then released it gently so it did not snap. He never looked back, but he never let more than 10 feet open between them either. He was reading the ground for her. Wyatt McCready rode last. He hummed an old Irish tune that his mother had sung in the kitchen of a house in Massachusetts that was now a pile of black timbers under mud, and his hands rested easy on the pommel of his saddle, and every few minutes he turned in the saddle and looked behind them, down through the trees. He was humming so his brothers would know without looking that the trail below was still empty. Abigail was only warm. The buffalo coat Ezra had put around her shoulders in the mud of Bitter Creek was thick and heavy and smelled of wood smoke and of an animal she had never smelled before, and under the coat her body was slowly remembering that it was a body. Her lip had stopped bleeding. Her palms ached with the deep, clean ache of skin that was simply going to heal and be done with it. She was alive. She had not expected to be. At a certain point, the trees began to thin. The horses stepped out onto a long, open shoulder of the mountain, and she lifted her face and saw for the first time where she was going. The cabin was built into a granite cliff. 2 stories of hand-squared timber fitted so tight in the corners that a knife blade would not have slid in between the logs, chinked with a pale clay the color of old bone. A shake roof with a stone chimney rising out of it that was already giving off a slow, pale line of wood smoke. A covered porch across the whole front with an axe leaning on a chopping block beside the door, and a row of snowshoes hanging from pegs along the wall. Behind it, against the cliff face, a root cellar had been cut directly into the rock, and a barn of the same tight timber stood off to the north with a corral that held 2 mules and a saddle horse she had not seen before, a broad-chested dun with a white blaze. Someone had built this to last 100 years. Someone she understood a moment later was still building it. Off to the side of the barn, a framework of fresh pine beams had been laid out in the grass, the beginnings of another room. Whoever had set those beams had set them square. The horses walked into the yard. Ezra dismounted first, and his boots struck the ground without sound. He came back to Silas's horse, and he lifted his arms up to Abigail, and he did not speak, only waited. She hesitated 1 second and then put her hands on his shoulders and let him lower her out of the saddle. Her legs almost gave under her. He did not let go until he was certain her feet were under her. And then he did let go, and he stepped back, and he nodded once, and he said, "Welcome to the cabin, ma'am." Silas swung down behind her. He walked past her to the door of the cabin, and he opened it, and the smell that came out of it hit Abigail like a blow to the chest, because it was not the smell of a rough camp or a bachelor's quarters. It was the smell of a home: bread, wood smoke, beeswax, something herbal and sweet. Wyatt dismounted last, and he had her carpet bag in one hand and her mother's small trunk balanced on the shoulder of the other, and he grinned at her past the weight of it. "Ma'am," he said, "you are about to walk into the only clean house north of Cheyenne. Do not tell any of them I said so. They will take it hard." She stepped up onto the porch, and Silas held the door open, and she walked inside. The main room was larger than any room she had expected in any cabin, in any territory. The fireplace took up most of one wall, stones as big as a man's chest laid up to the roof beam. A long oak table ran down the center of the room with 4 chairs. A braided rug covered most of the plank floor. A Dutch oven hung in the fire on an iron arm. The far wall was a row of shelves that held tin plates, cups, a stoneware crock, a tin of coffee, a blue glass jar of honey, a jar of dried apple slices, 2 candlesticks of beaten copper, and 4 books. A Bible, a book of Walt Whitman, a book of Emily Dickinson, a worn volume of Robert Burns. In the corner, under a window that looked east toward the rising sun, there was a small writing desk. And on the desk, in a stoneware jar, someone had put 3 stems of dried edelweiss. She stood very still and did not understand for a moment why her eyes had filled. She understood a moment later. Her mother had kept edelweiss in a jar on the piano in Boston. "There is no way," she said quietly, "that you could have known about the edelweiss." Silas had been hanging his buffalo coat on a peg by the door. He paused. He did not turn around. "Your father wrote a letter," he said, "in the spring, before he died. He said if I was ever to meet you, I would know you because you would look at flowers the way other women look at jewelry. I did not know what kind. Edelweiss grows on this mountain. I guessed." She turned her face away from all 3 of them, so none of them would see it. Ezra was at her elbow in the next second, and he was holding a tin cup of something hot. She sat. She drank. It was coffee black with a small bitterness underneath, and she understood after the second swallow that Ezra had put a willow bark tincture in it for her lip. He went to the shelves and came back with a small stone jar of something green and a clean square of linen. He cleaned the cuts. He did not ask her permission. He did it the way a man handles a horse's hoof, with complete attention and without any wasted motion. And when he was done, he said, "There, that is finished." "Thank you," she said. Silas stood by the fire. He was checking for hurt the way Ezra had checked her hands. When he was done, he said, "Mrs. McCready, my name is Abigail," she said. He inclined his head. "Then Abigail, there is a room through that door. It is yours. When you come out, we will talk." She said, "I would rather talk now." Silas nodded slowly. "All right." He pulled a chair from across the table. He sat across from her, and he put his big hands flat on the oak, and he looked at his hands for a moment before he looked at her face. "Abigail," he said, "you have a right to hear this before anything else. I am going to say it plain, because plain is the only way I know how to say a thing." "Please," she said. "I wrote to you," he said, "because your father asked me to, I know." "I did not write to you," he said, "because I wanted a wife." "I guess that," she said softly. He looked at her, then really looked at her, and she saw something in the amber eyes that was not anger and was not pity. It was something older and more tired than either of them. I had a wife, he said. Her name was Elizabeth Callahan. She died 6 winters ago. She died trying to bring our daughter into the world, and the child died with her. I buried them both under the birch behind this house. I did not think I would ever write another woman's name in my life. Then a letter came from your father last April, and then a letter came from you in August. And I sat at this table for 2 nights, and I did not sleep because I had made a promise to a dying man about a girl I had never met, and I did not know how to keep that promise and leave you free at the same time. Abigail set the tin cup down. Her hands were steady now. Go on, she said. Silas exhaled. Your father was murdered, he said. Josiah Blackwood killed him for a vein of copper that runs under the foothills and up under this mountain. He killed my father for the same copper 6 months before. If Blackwood had gotten to you in Boston or in Chicago or in Cheyenne, you would have been the third Prescott in a grave this year, Abigail. That is not speculation. That is a fact. Her mouth went dry. So he said, I did the only thing I could think to do that would let you travel openly on a train under my name and would make it legal in the eyes of a federal court for me to stand between you and Josiah Blackwood. I went to Cheyenne. I filed the paper. I asked a judge named Morrison to let an absentee bride sign on arrival. He has known my family since the Sioux business. He agreed the paper is real. The ink is direct. In the United States of America, as of 3 weeks ago, your name is Abigail Prescott McCready. And she said, what am I to make of that? You are to make of that, he said, whatever you choose to make of it. He leaned forward. His voice stayed quiet. Abigail, here is the arrangement. This cabin has 5 rooms. The main room, the kitchen through that door. My brother's room's upstairs. And a room that was built last spring that opens off the main room here with its own door and its own lock. That is your room. Until the snow melts, you will sleep in that room. I will sleep in the barn. Ezra and Wyatt will stay in their rooms as they always have. No man will enter your room without your word. That includes me. That especially includes me. She began to speak. He lifted one finger, only one, and she stopped. Food, he said. Ezra keeps the larder. You may cook if you wish to. You do not have to. There is no price on food in this house. You are not earning your keep. You are not a hired woman, Clear, she said. Work, he said. Wyatt will teach you to shoot. That is not a request. A woman on this mountain who cannot put a ball through a pine cone at 20 paces is a woman in danger, and I will not have you in danger. Ezra will teach you any herb craft you have interest in, and any bread baking, and any mending, but only if you ask. He will not press you. I will teach you nothing. I am not a teacher. I will chop wood and tend the stock and build onto the south wall and stay out of your path. And last he said, come spring, if you wish to remain here as my wife, in fact, as well as in paper, you will tell me so, and I will be the happiest man on this mountain. If you wish to leave, I will ride with you myself to San Francisco. I will put $1,000 into the hand of whatever bank you choose because your father's money is owed to you. You may begin again anywhere you please. There will be no recrimination. There will be no debt. The choice is yours. All winter to think. He lifted his right hand from the table and set it down palm up in the middle of the oak. He waited. Abigail looked at the hand. It was a working hand. It was a hand that had dug a grave for a wife and a daughter under a birch tree 6 winters ago. It was a hand that had this morning picked her up out of the mud of a main street in a town that had decided to watch her die. She put her hand down on top of his. Mr. McCready, she said. I accept the arrangement, she said. Every word of it, and my name as of this morning is Abigail McCready, and I would like, if nobody objects, to see my room, because I am about to fall asleep in this chair. Wyatt made a soft, low whistle from the doorway and said, Ezra. Ezra, tell the man he did not ruin it. Ezra at the sideboard permitted himself a small smile for the first time that day. Silas closed his hand very lightly over hers. Only for a breath, then he opened it again and he stood. This way, he said. The room at the back of the cabin had a bed with a real mattress stuffed with clean hay, and topped with a quilt pieced from squares of deep blue and cream and faded red. It had a washstand with a pitcher of hot water and a basin of white enamel. It had a window with lace curtains. The curtains were not perfect. One of the scallops along the hem was stitched slightly longer than the others, the way a man who has taught himself to sew at 30 years old will stitch a curtain for a sister-in-law he has not yet met. Abigail crossed the room and touched the hem with 2 fingers. Ezra from the doorway said, "They are crooked, I know. They are the most beautiful curtains I have ever seen," she said. And she did not turn around because she did not want any of them to see her face. She slept. She slept through the afternoon and through the dinner hour, and when she woke, it was fully dark, and there was a single candle burning on the washstand, and a plate of stew still warm under a pewter cover set on the chair beside the bed. She ate every bite. She blew out the candle, and she listened. The cabin was quiet, not silent, quiet. Wood settled in the fire. Wind moved across the shake roof. She had one thought before sleep took her again. She had not that night locked the door of her room. She had not even tried. The first week on the mountain passed in a pale gold light. She wore a borrowed flannel shirt of Ezra's over her own dress for warmth and rolled the sleeves 3 times. She learned where the well was and how the rope bucket worked. Small things. Her hands learned each one. Ezra kept his word about the herbs. On the third morning, he set a rough pine box on the kitchen table, and he opened it, and he showed her what was inside. Arrowleaf balsam root dried for fevers. Yarrow dried for wounds that would not close. Slippery elm for coughs. Willow bark for pain. He named each one in English, and then he named it quietly once in a Shoshone word he had learned from a Scottish army surgeon who had learned it long ago. Then he taught her to make bread. The starter was an old thing. It lived in a stoneware crock at the back of the kitchen shelf, and Ezra had named it Martha, and he spoke to it like a patient old cousin. It came from a kitchen in Williamsburg, Massachusetts, he told her, and had come west in the summer of 1874 in a tin cup wrapped in a wool sock inside his father's saddlebag. It had survived the Mill River flood of that year, which had taken their mother and most of their town and had put Silas and Ezra and Wyatt on a wagon west with their father 6 weeks later. Abigail listened to her hands deep in the cool, sour-smelling dough, and she did not speak. She understood that Ezra was handing her something, not just bread, a history. Wyatt kept his word about the shooting. He walked her out to the open shoulder of the mountain, and he set a pine cone on a flat stone at 20 paces, and he handed her a Colt revolver with a shortened grip that fit her palm better than the Army models did. The Colt had been filed down by Ezra Wyatt told her for small hands. "Ma'am," he said, "I will teach you one thing and one thing only for the first week. I will teach you to breathe. I know how to breathe, Mr. McCready." "Ma'am," he said, and he was grinning now, "you know how to breathe in a parlor. I am going to teach you to breathe with a piece of iron in your hand." He did. He stood behind her, and he put his left hand very lightly on her elbow, and his right hand a careful 2 inches from the small of her back, never quite touching, and he talked her through it. Slow in, slow out. Let the pine cone sit on top of the front sight. Do not pull the trigger. Squeeze the trigger. The noise will happen on its own. Do not flinch ahead of it. The bullet is faster than your flinch. She hit the pine cone on the third day. Wyatt whooped. He whooped like a boy, and he caught her by both shoulders, and then remembering himself, he stepped back fast and said, "Ma'am, apologies." She said, "Do that again, Mr. McCready. I like the whoop." He blinked, and then he whooped again louder, and she laughed for the first time since the parlor in Boston. Silas kept his word too. He kept it by staying out of her way. He rose before any of them. By the time she came down in the morning, he had already fed the mules and split the day's kindling and hung fresh water at the door. He did not sit at table with her for the first 3 suppers. He took a plate out to the barn. On the 4th night, she asked Ezra quietly why. Ezra did not look up from his mending. He thinks Ezra said that a woman who has been through what you have been through does not need a man at her elbow at every meal. He thinks he has to earn back the right to sit across from you. He will not put it that way, but that is what he thinks. Abigail set down her needle. Tell him, she said, that he is welcome at my table. Ezra finally looked up. Ma'am, he said, I will tell him no such thing. You will tell him, and you will do it tomorrow. She told him the next morning. Silas was at the chopping block in the thin gray light, and he had his sleeves rolled, and he had a clean split cedar in his hand. And when she came out onto the porch with her shawl around her shoulders, he stopped mid-swing and set the axe down. Mr. McCready, she said. Ma'am, I would like you, she said, to take your supper at this table tonight, and every night after. You built me a room. You are not to eat your meals in a barn because of it. That is not the arrangement. That is a punishment, and I did not ask for it, and I will not have it. He looked at her for a long second, then very quietly, Yes, Mrs. McCready, she said. Abigail. Abigail, he said. He came to supper that night. He did not say much. Wyatt carried most of the conversation, telling a long, improbable story about a bull elk that had tried to enter the cabin through the kitchen window the winter of '83 and had got stuck halfway. Abigail laughed until her healing lips stung. Silas watched her laugh. He did not join in, but the corner of his mouth moved once, and Ezra caught Abigail's eye across the table and nodded almost invisibly. After supper, Wyatt went out to check the mules. Ezra cleared the plates. Silas went to the fire and crouched to bank it for the night. Abigail stood up from the table. She crossed the room. She stopped 2 feet behind him. Mr. McCready, she said. Yes. Thank you, she said, for the Edelweiss. He did not turn around. He put one more piece of pine under the banked coals. You are welcome, Abigail, he said. She went to her room. She closed the door. She did not that night either turn the lock. Outside above the black line of the timber, the first real snow of the year began to fall fine and dry as sifted flour. And it fell all night, and by morning the mountain was white, and the trail down to Bitter Creek was closed. The snow did not stop for 3 days. It fell the way snow falls at 9,000 feet, dry and slow and patient. And by the third morning, the porch rail was buried, and the chopping block was only a round white hump beside the door, and the cabin had become a single warm room, floating inside a world of white silence. The trail down the mountain did not exist. The line of the timber did not exist. Even the sky did not exist because the sky had come down and had made itself the same color as the ground. Only the cabin was real and the 4 people inside it and the slow, steady red heart of the fire. She had thought at first that she would be afraid of that kind of silence. She was not. She was instead more awake than she had been in 6 months. She could hear her own pulse when she lay down at night. She could hear Wyatt snoring upstairs and Ezra's quieter breathing in the room next to his. And sometimes very late, she could hear Silas come back in from the barn stamp, the snow off his boots on the mat by the door, and stand for a long time in front of the banked fire without moving. She never rose to look. She only listened. She understood by the 4th night of this that he was checking the fire not for himself but for her, and that he had not once in all of his standing by the hearth come near her door. The arrangement was holding. It was holding in the way Ezra cleared the breakfast plates so that she would not have to lift her healing palms over the steam of the wash basin. It was holding in the way Wyatt every afternoon at 2 stuck his head into the main room and said, "Ma'am, your lesson," and led her out into the churned snow of the yard with a colt and a tin can perched on the snowshoed top of a fence post. It was holding in the way Silas, whenever he passed her in the narrow hallway, took one small step sideways to give her wall room every time without ever seeming to notice he was doing it. It was holding in the fact that her door had stayed unlocked for 6 nights running and nothing at all had happened because of it. And it was holding most of all in an oak table. They ate their 3 meals at that table now. Wyatt told the story of the summer Silas tried to break a mule named Admiral Farragut, and Admiral Farragut broke Silas instead for 3 weeks. He told the story of the time Ezra, at 14, had quietly removed a bullet from a stranger on the kitchen table and had closed the wound with a horsehair he had boiled twice and had gone back to reading a book of poetry with hands that were still wet. He told these stories looking at Abigail with his bright, hard grin, and his brothers would correct the details dryly from each side, and Abigail understood that Wyatt was handing her the family the only way he knew how, piece by piece, story by story. Here is who we have been. See if you can love any of it. You love. She could. She did. She laughed sometimes until her ribs ached, and she saw the way the laughter loosened something in the set of Silas's shoulders across the table, and she understood that her laughter was a medicine she had not known she was carrying. Ezra came to her differently. Ezra came to her through her hands. He taught her bread. He taught her apple butter, stirring it for 3 hours at the hearth with a long wooden paddle, while the cabin filled with a smell that made Wyatt come in from the barn twice on the pretext of needing a cup of water. He taught her yarrow for wounds and arnica for bruises, and he taught her one evening by the fire with her father's Bible open in her lap, the name of every flower that would come up on the south shoulder of the mountain when the snow went: glacier lily, spring beauty, shooting star, Indian paintbrush, edelweiss last of all in late summer. He did not touch her. Not once, not even by accident, and yet by the 10th day she would have trusted Ezra McCready with the whole of her life. Silas came to her last. Silas came to her slowest. He came to her through work. He built. He built all through the first snow and the second snow and into the deep, still cold of December. And what he built was the south wall of a new room off the kitchen. And when Abigail finally asked him on the fourth Sunday what the new room was for, he did not answer her directly. He said, "It is a room that this cabin has needed for a long time. It will be ready by spring." But she saw 2 days later that he had set a small window into the south wall at the height of a woman's face, not a man's, and she understood that he was building a sewing room. He was building it because a woman might sew, and if she did, she ought to have the light. She did not tell him that she had seen the window. She only watched at supper the way his hands moved when he passed her the salt. They were the same hands that had set that window. They moved carefully around her plate every time, the way a man's hands will move around a thing he is afraid of breaking without meaning to. On the 23rd of November, a Monday, she stopped pretending. She had watched him that night cross the main room in his stocking feet, with his boots in his hand, and kneel on the hearth rug and feed 2 dry chunks of pine into the fire. She heard her own voice say before she had decided to let it, "Mr. McCready." He did not startle. He had known she was there. He always knew she was there. "Abigail," he said, "would you," she said, "sit with me for a little while, if you have nothing waiting?" He considered the fire. He considered the poker in his hand. He set the poker down on the hearthstones very carefully. He stood. He did not sit in the rocker because the rocker was hers. He brought a straight chair from the table and set it at an angle to her. "I have nothing waiting," he said. "Tell me about Elizabeth," she said. Silas did not speak for a long time. He looked at the fire. He laid his big scarred hands one inside the other on his knee, and he let the silence sit with him. "Elizabeth Callahan," he said finally, "was the daughter of a blacksmith in Laramie. She had red hair. Not auburn. Red. The kind that does not photograph. She could read 6 languages because her father had believed that a blacksmith's daughter ought to know Latin and Greek and French and German and Italian and Spanish, and he had taught her all of them before she was 16. She taught school in a one-room in Medicine Bow for 2 years before I met her. She was older than me by 11 months. She corrected my grammar at our first supper 4 times. He smiled a little at the fire. "I asked her to marry me on a Tuesday," he said. "She said she would consider it through the week. She said yes on Saturday, and she said she wanted to be married by the following Tuesday. I said that was too soon for a proper wedding. She said, 'Silas McCready, if I am going to spend the rest of my life on a mountain with you, I do not intend to waste a week of it waiting for Aunt Agatha to come up from Denver.'" He was quiet for a breath. "We had 2 years," he said, 2 years and 4 months to be exact. I had come home from the Sioux business in the fall of '77 with a bullet hole in my leg and no wish to ever ride under another Army flag as long as I lived. I met her the following spring in Laramie. We were married by the fall. She was carrying by the second winter. She was 7 months gone, and by the spring of 79, she was very tired. Ezra had been at her elbow every day. He was 24 then. He had already read every medical book in Cheyenne twice. He told me that week outside the house not to expect an easy birth. I did not listen. You do not listen when you are 27 and your wife is laughing again because you are home. Abigail did not move. She went into labor on the 14th of May, he said. It lasted 3 days. The child was turned wrong. Ezra did everything a man with his hands could do, and he could not turn her. My daughter was born on the 17th at sunrise. She was alive for about 2 hours. Elizabeth was alive until that evening. Ezra said later that there had been nothing anyone could have done. Ezra was 24. He has never stopped believing it was his fault. He will not ever stop believing it. That is something you should know, Abigail, about the man who bakes your bread. He will smile at you and he will teach you yarrow. And underneath all of it, he is still 24 and he is still standing outside this cabin in the dark because he cannot go back in. Oh, she said, Silas said I buried them under the birch behind the house because Elizabeth had said once in the second summer that she liked how the light came through that tree in October. I dug the grave myself. Wyatt tried to help. I would not let him. Wyatt was 21. He had lost a mother and a sister-in-law and a niece in the space of 5 years, and our father had come back from that third grave, a man I did not recognize, and I thought wrongly that I could spare my brother one more shovel. He was quiet. I named her Hannah, he said. The child, after my mother's mother. She is under the birch with her mother. I carved the stone myself. It took me 4 months because I did not know how to carve. I do now. The fire popped. Abigail closed her book. She leaned forward a little. She did not reach for him. She only put her hand palm down on the small round table between the rocker and the straight chair, and she left it there open. You asked me, Silas said after a long moment, why I wrote to you. Yes, I need to tell you, he said the rest. The rest is that I had sworn to God after I dug that grave that I would not be the reason another woman was hurt in this world. Not my wife, not my sister, not my neighbor. I had decided I was done with the risk of it. Your father's letter came 6 years after that decision. Your letter came 6 years and 4 months after it. And I sat at this table, Abigail, with your letter in my hand, and I thought, I cannot do this. I cannot bring a 23-year-old girl up onto this mountain in my name. I cannot stand between her and Josiah Blackwood and then fail her the way I failed Elizabeth. I did not sleep for 2 nights. What changed, she asked. He turned his face toward her. In the firelight, his eyes were not amber. They were gold. I read your father's last letter again, he said. The one he wrote when he knew Blackwood was coming for him. He said, Silas, I am asking you for my daughter what my hand asked of your father in the mud at the sunken road. And your father did not hesitate. He did not sit at a table for 2 nights, deciding whether he could afford it. He put me on his shoulder and he walked. And I read that, Abigail, and I put the letter down and I said out loud in this room to no one, all right, all right. He stopped. And I got up, he said, and I saddled the dun and I rode to Cheyenne and I filed the paper. Her hand was still open on the table. His hand slowly came off his knee and he laid it palm down across from hers. He did not touch her. He left perhaps 3 inches of oak between them. It was the exact width she understood a moment later of the rule he had set himself. She slid her hand forward and closed the 3 inches. Her fingers went over his, not under, over, the way a woman takes a hand that has been offered to her in full light at a table in a house in front of God, in the fire in the last of an autumn that had already almost killed her. Silas did not move. And then very slowly the tips of his fingers closed barely around the edge of her palm. I am going to stay, Silas, she said. He did not look at her. He looked at their 2 hands on the table. The firelight moved across them, and it made the old rope burn on his wrist gleam like a pale thread. Abigail, he said. Not tomorrow, she said. Not out of gratitude. Not because there is nowhere else. I want you to hear me. I am staying because a month ago I did not know your name, and tonight I know the name of your wife and the name of your daughter, and the name of the tree they are buried under. I am staying because your brother built me a window for a room I had not yet asked for. I am staying because your other brother makes me laugh, and he has not made himself laugh in a long time, and I think he is starting to again. I am staying because when I came in out of the mud, you did not tell me I was safe. You made me safe. There is a difference, and at 23, I am old enough to know what it is. His thumb moved just once across the back of her hand. He laughed. Whoa. It was a small sound. It came up from low in his chest, and it was rough from lack of use. And it was the first time she had ever heard him laugh, and it made the corner of his mouth lift in a way that took 10 years off his face. All right, he said. All right, she said. They sat with the fire for a long time after that. They did not speak. His hand stayed under hers on the little table. In the cabin, Abigail finally lifted her hand off Silas's. She stood. She folded her shawl over her arm. She said, "Good night, Mr. McCready." He stood too. He did not reach for her. He did not kiss her. He only inclined his head and he said, "Good night, Abigail." She went to her room. She closed the door. She did not lock it. 3 weeks passed. They were not idle weeks. On the second morning of December, a boy no older than 14 showed up at the North Trail on a foundered pony, half frozen, carrying a folded square of paper sewn into the lining of his coat. Wyatt found him at the tree line and brought him in. The boy would not say who had sent him. He only handed the paper to Silas and watched the fire while Ezra gave him hot coffee and a plate of bread. The paper was in Doc Ambrose Hollister's hand. It said 4 lines only. Gideon Cross arrived in Bitter Creek on Saturday. 20 men, 20 horses. Cole Harding has asked Blackwood for leave to ride alone and come up the South Cliff while the others attack. Blackwood has said yes. Blackwood has paid out of the bank's own safe. They ride before the full moon. I cannot come myself, A.H. Silas read it twice. He burned it in the hearth. He rode out that afternoon and was gone for 2 days scouting the lower switchbacks, and when he came back, he sat at the oak table with his brothers and Abigail, and he laid out every rise, every blind corner, every stand of timber between the cabin and the valley. He drew it with a piece of charcoal on a sheet of butcher paper. They studied that map every night for 3 weeks. They walked out to the sewing room window and to the chimney side ledge and to the root cellar door, and they counted steps. By the evening of the 13th, they knew the ground the way a man knows the inside of his own palm. 3 weeks later, the mountain broke. It broke on the 14th of December, a Wednesday, in the dead black hours well before dawn. Wyatt McCready, who slept with one ear, always turned toward the barn, sat up in his bed on the second floor at 4:15, and knew before he was fully awake that something had changed. He listened. He heard nothing. That was the wrong thing to hear. At that hour of a December morning in the deepest cold of the night, there were normally the small sounds of the dun horse shifting in his stall, the occasional cough of a mule, the wind moving against the eaves. This morning there was only silence, the particular listening silence of animals who know something is standing out in the dark. He swung his legs out of bed. He did not light a candle. He put on his trousers and his boots, and he took the 2 colts off the peg by the door. And he walked loose-heeled down the stairs the way a man walks who expects to need to move fast. Silas was already at the front window. He had come in from the barn half an hour before the way he came in every night now, to bank the fire one last time before the coldest hours. And this night, unlike every other night, he had not gone back out. He had stood at the hearth in his stocking feet in his buffalo coat for 3 full minutes without moving, and then he had crossed to the front window instead of the door, and he had stayed there, and he had not lit a lamp. He had been at that window for 40 minutes by the time Wyatt came down the stairs. Down the slope of the meadow where the edge of the north timber came up out of the dark, there were 3 points of faint orange light. They were not stars. Stars did not sit at that height, and they did not flicker. They were the banked ends of 3 cigarettes or 3 pipes or 3 cheroots, and the men who were smoking them were trying very hard to keep them low and hidden in their fists, and they had almost succeeded. "Almost," Wyatt Silas said very quietly. "I see them," Wyatt said. "How many?" "I count 3 at the timber. There will be more." Ezra, awake, Ezra said from the kitchen doorway, buttoning a flannel shirt over his long underwear, and his voice was as level as if they had been discussing the day's bread. There are 4 more on the East Ridge. I saw them from the pantry window. They have been moving into position for about an hour. 7, Silas said. 7 that we can see, said Ezra. And Cole is out there somewhere on the south, if Doc was right. Silas did not move from the window. He spoke without turning around, and his voice was perfectly ordinary, the voice of a man calling a meeting to order. Abigail, he said. She was already in the main room. She had come out of her room on stocking feet 2 minutes before because she had heard the creak of the floorboard by the hearth. That meant Silas had gotten up in the dark, and she had learned in the last 3 weeks to read that board the way other women read a husband's face. She was standing at the corner of the oak table in her flannel wrapper with her hair in a single loose braid down her back. Abigail, Silas said again, without turning. Dress warm, wool over wool, your boots not your shoes. Braid tight so it is not under your collar. Bring the colt. Do not load it until I tell you. And Abigail, listen. There will be a 4th direction. Cole Harding is coming up the South Cliff on his own. Doc Hollister's boy told us so. The south window in the sewing room opens onto the only line of sight that covers that corner. When you hear the first shot in the yard, that window is yours. I do not want to leave you a fight. But Cole is a coward, and he will come for a closed door with a woman behind it, not for my rifle. Can you hold that window? She did not answer at once. She looked at him and at the door and at the peg where the Colt hung and at the man who had asked her plainly at the oak table in his kitchen to stand and fight for the room he had built for her. She said, I can hold it, Silas. He nodded once. Good. Load when you reach the window. Not before. Yes, she said. She went. She did not ask a single question. Wyatt, said Silas. The Sharps is already at the door. Take it. Take the bandolier and both powder horns and the glass from my saddlebag. Go up the chimney side to the ledge. You know the ledge. I know it. Ezra, the bag of medical, the coil of rope, the axe from the porch, small one, not the big one. Go to the root cellar door and stay inside it. You are the fallback. You are not a rifle today. If one of them gets past Wyatt and past me, he will meet you at the cellar door, and after that, he will not be a problem any longer. Clear, said Ezra. Me, said Silas, and he still had not turned from the window. I will go out the front. I will walk out like a man going to the barn to check his stock. When they shoot at me, and they will, Wyatt will have a line on the gun flashes from the ledge. Wyatt will end this in 5 minutes. Silas said, Wyatt, brother, if there are 20 of them and not 7, then we fall back to the cabin and we burn them off the porch 1 rifle at a time. But there are not 20 here. The other 13 are freezing on the switchback because their horses gave out and they will not be in position until the sun is up. Gideon Cross was never a patient man. Gideon Cross, said Ezra softly. So it is him. Doc Hollister was telling the truth, said Silas. Now, go. They went. Abigail came back out in a dark wool dress in a heavy knit sweater of Silas's that fell past her hips, and she had her hair in the tight braid he had asked for, and her boots were laced, and she had the Colt in her hand, and it was unloaded, and the 5 brass cartridges were in her other fist. She stopped beside Silas at the window. He did not look at her. He said, Abigail, I am here. I am going out in about 2 minutes. If I am hit, you will not come out. Do you understand me? No. He did look at her then. I understand the words she said. I do not accept them. If you are hit, I am not going to watch you freeze to death through a door. His jaw tightened. Abigail, this is not a thing we have time to argue. Then do not argue it. Agree with me. If you go down in the yard, Wyatt will finish the man who shot you from the ledge, and Ezra will come from the cellar, and I will come from the door, and we will carry you inside together. That is what is going to happen. I am not a woman who stands behind a door while my husband bleeds in the snow, Silas McCready. I never was going to be. He looked at her for 1 full breath. All right, he said. He took his own rifle off the pegs, a short-barreled Winchester, not the Sharps. He checked to the tube. He put on his buffalo coat. He put on his fur cap. He did not put on gloves because a man in gloves cannot work the lever of a Winchester in the cold. He crossed to the door. He put his hand on the latch. He paused. Abigail, he said, yes. If this goes wrong, it will not go wrong if it does. She stepped up beside him at the door. She put her free hand on his forearm over the heavy buffalo fur. She did not squeeze. She just laid her hand there. Silas, she said, go and do your work and come home to this door, because I am going to be standing on the other side of it and I am going to open it for you. He bent his head. He did not kiss her. He only pressed his forehead for 1 second against the top of her braid. Then he straightened. Then he opened the door. Then he stepped out into the cold before dawn, and he pulled the door closed behind him to the width of her hand. She stood inside the door. She did not breathe. He walked out across the yard at an easy pace. He was halfway to the barn when the first shot cracked out of the north timber, and a second later there was a louder cracking whip sound from the rocks above the cabin, and Abigail understood that was the Sharps, that was Wyatt, and that somewhere in the north timber, one of the 3 cigarettes had just stopped burning forever. Silas dropped to one knee in the yard and brought the Winchester up, and he fired levered, fired 3 rounds into 3 specific corners of the dark. The Sharps spoke again. The East Ridge went silent. From the root cellar, Ezra's voice came in a low, even call. One coming up the north side, Silas. Close. I hear him, said Silas. He rolled smooth as oil from his knee onto his left shoulder, and as he rolled, he brought the Winchester across his body, and he fired once from the ground at a shape that had come out of the north timber running, and the shape fell without a sound. Silas came up on the other side of the roll, already moving, already backing, and he was coming back toward the cabin, now walking backward with the Winchester still shouldered. Abigail was already gone from the front door. She had closed it behind her to the width of his hand the way Silas had said, and she had moved. She had moved the way Wyatt had drilled into her in week 2, not running, not dawdling, 3 fast, steady strides across the main room to the inside of the south wall, to the door of the sewing room. She had opened that door. She had gone in. She had crossed to the window Silas had set at the height of her face, and she had lifted the latch with her left hand, and she had pushed the window open 4 inches into the gray snow air. And she saw him, Cole Harding. He had not come up the north meadow with the others. He had not come up the east ridge. He had come up the south through the drifted snow against the cliff face the way no one was supposed to be able to come up. And he had come up alone. He was on the south side of the cabin now, 20 feet from the corner, and he had a long boning knife in one hand and a short pistol in the other. And his face was the bruised purple patchwork. It had been the last time she had seen it. And he was grinning and he was moving, and he was coming for the south window. The window of the sewing room, the window Silas had set for her at the height of her face. He did not know she was there yet. He did not know the window had an eye behind it. He was coming for a pane of glass that he meant to break with his shoulder before any man in the cabin heard him. Abigail did what Wyatt McCready had taught her to do. She breathed in, she held, she breathed out. She thumbed the hammer of the Colt back to full cock. Cole Harding came around the corner of the cabin with his knife low and his pistol high and his bruised grin wide, and he was looking at the window. And he did not look up, because men like Cole Harding do not look up. And Abigail Prescott McCready, 23 years old, Boston banker's daughter, put the front sight of a filed-down Colt .45 revolver on the top of his right thigh, and she squeezed. The noise happened on its own. The bullet was faster than her flinch. Cole Harding went down in the snow with a sound that was not a word. The knife fell. The pistol fell. He rolled onto his back, and he was clutching his leg with both hands, and the blood was coming up between his fingers, the way water comes up out of a cracked pipe, dark and steady, and not arterial, because she had not hit the big vessel, because she had not meant to, because she had aimed for the meat of the thigh the way Wyatt had drilled her in week 2. Stop him. Do not kill him. A dead man cannot tell a judge what he was doing. Cole Harding stared up at the window. He saw her. His bruised face went slack. "You," he croaked. "Lie still," she said through the open window. "Lie still. Mr. Harding and I will not put the second one in your shoulder. Move and I will." He lay still. Out in the yard, the last of the North timber guns went silent under the slow, heavy authority of Wyatt's sharps. The East Ridge had been silent for 30 seconds already. The snow fell and the blue dawn began to edge toward gray, and somewhere off to the south, miles away, a man with one eye and 20 men behind him on the switchback understood as he heard the rhythm of the distant shots die off in a way he had not expected, that he had miscalculated. Silas came around the corner of the cabin at a walk rifle low. He saw coal in the snow. He saw the open window above. He saw his wife through the window with the Colt still level and the smoke still curling off the muzzle, and her face was very white, and her jaw was set and her braid had not come loose. He walked to Cole Harding. He looked down at him. He did not speak. He turned very slowly toward the window. "Abigail," he said. "I am all right," she said. "Are you?" "I will be," she said. "I just want to put this gun down. I do not want to keep holding it." "Then put it down." She uncocked the Colt. She laid it with great care on the narrow sill of the sewing room window. She did not take her eyes off Cole Harding. Ezra came up from the cellar at a run and knelt beside Cole in the snow, and without any particular expression, tore open the leg of the man's trousers and put his hand over the wound and began to stop the bleeding, because Ezra McCready did not let men die in his yard, not even Cole Harding. Wyatt came down off the ledge. A minute later, the sharps on his shoulders snow to his knees. He looked at the three bodies in the north meadow and the shape on the east ridge, and at Cole Harding bleeding in the snow with Ezra's hands on him, and at his sister-in-law still standing in the sewing room window with her braid perfect and her hands finally beginning to shake. He whooped. It was not a whoop of joy. It was something older. It was the sound a man makes at the end of a long night when the thing he was afraid of has passed, and it echoed off the cliff face and back across the meadow and down into the timber, where somewhere Gideon Cross was turning his horse back down the mountain and understanding that he was going to have to take this news to Josiah Blackwood himself. Inside the cabin, Silas put the Winchester down on the table. He walked to the sewing room. He opened the door. Abigail turned from the window. She looked at him across the half-built room, and she did not move. She could not for a moment. Her knees had not yet agreed to her standing. Silas crossed the room in 3 long strides. He did not touch her. He stopped 1 foot in front of her. He looked down into her face the way a man looks at something he is afraid is going to dissolve if he blinks. And she reached up because he was not going to, and she put her hands flat against the front of his buffalo coat, and she said, "Silas, I am going to kiss you, because if I do not kiss you right now, I am going to sit down on this floor and cry for an hour, and I would rather kiss you." "Then kiss me," he said. She did. It was the first kiss. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. His beard was cold from the yard, and his lips were warm, and she felt the catch of his breath against her mouth, and she felt his arms come up at last and close around her, careful, strong, complete the way a man closes a door against a storm. Outside, the mountain held its silence. Inside the half-built sewing room under a window set at a woman's height, a promise from Antietam that had been 23 years in the keeping was at last paid in full. When she pulled back, he pressed his forehead against hers. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. The devil's spine had been taken. The reckoning had only begun. The winter after the devil's spine was the longest of Silas McCready's life and the shortest of his wife's. For Silas, it was long because he was waiting. He was waiting for Gideon Cross to come back up the mountain with the other 13 men, and he was waiting for Josiah Blackwood to send a second posse, and he was waiting for a federal court in Cheyenne to either bless him or indict him for the bodies in the North Meadow and on the East Ridge, and the one man in the root cellar with a ball in his leg and a length of Ezra's rope on his wrist. For Abigail it was short because she had at last a door of her own and a husband and a hearth, and time moves fast when a woman is coming out of the cold. What came up the mountain in January was not Gideon Cross. It was snow. A great deal of it. The pass at Devil's Spine closed on the second week of January under a drift that reached the shoulder of a tall man, and after that no one came up and no one went down. Cole Harding healed in the root cellar, which Ezra had rigged as a cell, with a straw mattress and a bucket and a chain long enough for a man to stand up in, but not long enough for him to reach the door. Ezra brought him food twice a day. Ezra changed his bandages. Ezra spoke to him exactly as much as he spoke to the mules, which was not at all. Cole, for his part, had found after the first week of silence that he did not wish to speak either. There was nothing to say to a man who had put a clean shot through the meat of his thigh and then, without raising her voice, had told him to lie still and had held the Colt level on him through the window until her brother-in-law came up from the cellar with rope. Silas sat at the oak table on the first night of the new year, the 1st of January, in the year of our Lord, 1886, with a single sheet of paper in front of him and a steel nib pen in his hand, and he wrote a letter to Federal Judge Morrison in Cheyenne. The letter was 3 pages long. It explained in the plainest sentences Silas could construct everything that had happened in his yard on the 14th of December. It named Cole Harding as a prisoner of the McCready family held for the lawful authority of the United States. It enclosed Doc Hollister's note, which Silas had not in the end burned, but had rescued from the embers at the last second and kept folded under his Bible. It requested formally and respectfully that a United States Marshal be dispatched to the cabin in the spring at the first passable trail to take custody of Cole Harding and to hear sworn testimony on the subjects of the murder of Thomas McCready in 1885, in the murder of William Theodore Prescott in the same year, and on the subject of one Josiah Blackwood, of Bitter Creek banker, who Silas believed had ordered both. He signed it, Silas McCready, his wife Abigail Prescott. McCready signed beneath him and beneath her, Ezra Henry McCready and Wyatt Jeremiah McCready, in that order, oldest to youngest. Silas folded the letter. He sealed it with a drop of beeswax. He put it into an oilcloth packet. He told Wyatt, "When the Black Pass opens, you ride." "I will ride," Wyatt said. It took 4 months for the Black Pass to open. In those 4 months, a great many things happened in that cabin that had nothing to do with rifles. Abigail learned to ride. Not the Boston way side saddle in a park, but the mountain way astride in a split skirt Ezra cut down for her out of an old wool trade blanket. Wyatt put her on the broad-chested dun with a white blaze, and he walked beside her for the first week with his hand on the dun's bridle, and by the 3rd week, as she was riding out alone to the ridge to check Ezra's trap line for marten, she learned to read a set of hoof prints. She learned to tell a coyote track from a wolf track by the way the snow had been pushed. She learned to make a splint from green alder and to set the leg of a young mule that had slipped on ice and to bring a calf into the world tail first in the back of the barn at 3 o'clock in the morning, with Ezra talking her through it step by step in a voice that never rose above a murmur. By February, she could do more on a mountain in one day than most city women could do in a season, and when Silas saw her come into the kitchen one evening with her hair full of snow and her cheeks red from the wind and a brace of rabbits in her hand, he stopped in the doorway between the main room and the kitchen, and he just looked at her. And she looked at him, and neither of them said anything. And they did not need to. On the 11th of February, in the evening by the hearth, she asked him when he thought they ought to be properly married. He looked up from the boot he was oiling. "Abigail," he said, "we are properly married. I filed in Cheyenne. That is married in the United States." "I know that," she said. "I mean in a church or in a house by a man who knows a vow when he hears one." He set the boot down. He thought about it. Then he said, "There is a circuit rider who comes up from Fort Washakie every spring. His name is Reverend Josiah Whitaker. He is a Methodist. He does not mind coming up the mountain because he does not mind a ride. I can send him word when the pass opens. He could be here by the 1st of May. "The 1st of May," she said. "That is a good month for a wedding." "It is," he said. "Will you mind," she asked, "being married by a Methodist?" He considered. "I was raised Presbyterian," he said. "My father was Catholic because of my mother. My mother was Catholic because she was Irish. Elizabeth was Episcopal. I do not think between all of that any one denomination has much claim on a McCready, and I do not think God minds which book a good man reads his name out of. She smiled. Reverend Whitaker it is then. The Black Pass opened on the 3rd of April. Wyatt rode. He came back 10 days later, and he did not come back alone. He rode up into the yard on his black horse, with his sharps across his back, and his 2 colts on his hips, and his grin firmly in place, and behind him rode 4 men. The first was a tall, thin man in a long gray duster and a star badge on his chest the size of a small saucer. His name was Jedediah Walsh, and he was a deputy United States Marshal out of Cheyenne, and he had known Thomas McCready since the war. The second was a shorter, heavier man in a plain suit of black broadcloth with a white collar and a pair of spectacles. This was the Reverend Josiah Whitaker, 3 weeks ahead of schedule because the news Wyatt had brought down had moved him. The third was a Pinkerton agent named John Allen Caldwell, sent up from Denver by Amalgamated Copper Syndicate to witness formally the status of the copper vein that ran under the McCready land because the syndicate did not want any part of a deed that had been signed over a dead man's body. The fourth, to everyone's surprise, was Francis E. Warren himself, the territorial governor of Wyoming, a neat, gray-bearded man with a tailored coat and a steady eye and the unhurried carriage of a man who had come up the hard way and knew it. Silas stepped down off the porch. He took off his hat, which he did not often do. He said, "Governor." Mr. McCready said, "Francis Warren, I understand you have a prisoner in your root cellar." "I do, sir." "And a letter in the pocket of the United States Marshal there, which I have read on the trail and which I would like, if you will permit, to have read again in your yard in front of your wife and your brothers, so that every person here can agree to what is written in it before we go any further." "Please," said Silas. "Read it." Marshal Walsh read the letter. It took him 10 minutes. He read it slowly, without hurry, and when he was done, he folded it and put it back in his coat. "Is this letter true, Mr. McCready?" said the governor. "Every word of it," said Silas. "Mrs. McCready," said the governor, turning to her. "Would you swear to that?" "I would, sir," said Abigail clearly. "I will, sir, on any Bible you care to bring out." "Then," said Governor Warren, "I will ask you all gentlemen to take the prisoner out of that cellar, and I will ask Marshal Walsh to convey him to the federal jail in Cheyenne, and I will ask the Pinkerton agent to inspect record and witness the copper vein under this land, and I will ask the Reverend to stay to whatever business Mr. and Mrs. McCready have for him, and I will ask Mrs. McCready personally, with her permission, to ride down with me to Bitter Creek at first light tomorrow, because I intend to go into Josiah Blackwood's bank in person, and I should like the daughter of William Prescott at my elbow when I do it." Abigail looked at Silas. Silas looked at Abigail. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He said, "Governor, my wife goes where my wife chooses to go, and I go where my wife goes. May I bring my brothers?" "You may bring," said Francis Warren dryly, "the entire mountain." "Mr. McCready, I have worn this office just over a year, and I have been waiting every day of it to watch Josiah Blackwood's face when his own governor walks into his bank. I would not deny you your share." They left at first light. They came down off the mountain on the 14th of April, the governor and the marshal, and the Pinkerton, and the Reverend and Silas, and Ezra, and Wyatt, and Abigail. And they came down together, 9 riders abreast where the trail would allow it, and in single file where it would not. And at noon they came into Bitter Creek. They did not come in shooting. They came in walking. The 9 horses walked down the main street at the same slow, deliberate pace with which 3 horses had ridden out of it 6 months before. Bitter Creek stopped. The blacksmith stopped hammering. The woman at the general store, Mabel Thornhill, came out from behind her counter and stood in her doorway with her apron still on and her hand at her throat. The boy with the shoe brush, who was not so small anymore, stood up on his wooden crate. Sheriff Elias Thornton came out of his office and saw the star on Marshal Walsh's chest, and saw the man riding beside Walsh, and recognized across 20 paces the territorial governor of Wyoming, and sat down abruptly on his own boardwalk as if his legs had given out. Josiah Blackwood came to the door of his bank. He was wearing the same black broadcloth suit and the same gold watch chain. His face when he saw them did something delicate and controlled. And then when he saw Governor Warren, it did something that could not be controlled. It went white under the smooth skin. His hand on the door frame whitened where it gripped. "Mr. Blackwood," said the governor pleasantly as he dismounted, "I am Francis Warren. I believe we have been corresponding." "I am honored, Governor," said Blackwood, and the warm voice was still there, but now it shook very slightly at the edges. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "To a letter," said Warren, "several letters, most recently one from a Mr. Silas McCready of this county. A letter which it seems describes a great deal of banking activity I was not aware of." Blackwood's eyes cut sideways. They found on Warren's right the Pinkerton agent, Caldwell, with his notebook already open. They found on Warren's left Marshal Walsh with his coat open and the long-barreled Colt on his hip in plain view. They found behind Warren 4 McCreadys and Abigail Prescott, and they stopped. "Miss Prescott," said Blackwood softly. "Mrs. McCready," said Abigail. He bowed slightly. "Mrs. McCready, then." "You murdered my father," she said. There was no tremor in her voice at all. There was the same voice she had used in the mud in October, when she had still been Prescott, when she had still been bleeding, when no one in this street had moved to save her. Only it was not in the mud now. It was in the open air of noon in front of her governor, in front of her husband, in front of witnesses. The town moved. Not out of cover, into it. Mabel Thornhill stepped down off her doorstep into the street. The blacksmith walked out of his shop, the hammer still in his hand. The clerk from the Blackwood Arms came out onto the boardwalk and stood beside Sheriff Thornton and put one hand quietly on Thornton's shoulder. Doc Ambrose Hollister opened the door of his clinic and stepped out and removed his hat and held it against his chest. The boy with the shoe brush jumped down off his crate and walked on his own through the snow and stopped beside Abigail's horse and looked up at her. Abigail smiled down at him and did not speak. He smiled back, and the smile was like a lamp being lit. Josiah Blackwood tried one last time. "Mrs. McCready," he said, "surely we can sort this in the territorial courts. There is no need for theatrics." "Mr. Blackwood," said Governor Warren, "my dear sir, you are going to come with Marshal Walsh now to the federal jail in Cheyenne. You are going to face in the federal court their charges of conspiracy to defraud, forgery of federal banking instruments, and murder in the first degree on 2 counts to begin with. What you do after that is, as you say, a matter for the courts. What you do in the next 3 minutes is a matter for the United States Marshal standing beside me." "Marshal," Mr. Blackwood said Jedediah Walsh quietly, "your hands where I can see them, please." It was quick after that. Blackwood did not draw. He did not run. He put his hands out in front of him as he had done in the street in October, but it was a different gesture this time. It was the gesture of a small man who had at last understood that the ground under him was no longer his own. Walsh put the irons on his wrists. Walsh walked him out into the middle of the street. Walsh set him on a horse, and the town of Bitter Creek at long last found its voice. It did not cheer, it did not shout, it did something smaller, and to Abigail infinitely more satisfying. It turned its back on Josiah Blackwood. One by one, every man and woman who had turned his or her back on her in October turned now and put it to him. Mabel Thornhill, the blacksmith, the clerk, Doc Hollister, and last Sheriff Elias Thornton, who stood up slowly from his boardwalk and walked with shaking hands across the dirty snow of the street and stopped in front of Abigail and unpinned his badge from his vest and held it up to her. "Mrs. McCready," he said, "I was a coward. I should have spoken in October. I should have spoken in the summer when Doc Hollister came to me with what he had seen on your father's body in Cheyenne. I did not speak, and I am not fit to wear this. I will ride to Cheyenne with the marshal and testify to every crooked thing I have seen done in Josiah Blackwood's office, and then I will go east to my sister in Ohio, and I will not come back because I do not deserve to. Please take the badge, ma'am. It is the only thing I have that is worth giving." Abigail looked at the badge. She looked at the man. She did not touch the badge. Mr. Thornton, she said, I am not a sheriff and I do not collect sheriff's badges. Give it to Governor Warren. Ride to Cheyenne. Tell the court everything you know, and then go home to your sister. Not because you do not deserve this town, Mr. Thornton, because this town has a second chance at being a town, and it will be simpler to start it without any of us who remember what it was before. He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes filled. He did not let the tears fall. He nodded once. He turned to Governor Warren and he handed the badge to the governor, and the governor put it without ceremony into his coat pocket. Doc Hollister came forward then. He stopped at Silas's stirrup. He looked up. Mr. McCready, he said. Doc said, Silas. I sent my boy up in December, said Hollister. I know you know that. I do, said Silas. Mr. McCready, I am a coward, sir. I have been a coward since the spring of 1885 when Josiah Blackwood showed me the body of your father in the coroner's office in Cheyenne and told me that if I wrote the truth on the certificate, my wife Margaret would be found at the bottom of the same ravine by the end of the week. I wrote a lie on that certificate. I have lived with that lie every day since. My boy is 14 years old, Mr. McCready. He is the bravest person I have ever known. Because when I told him in December what was coming up that mountain, he got on a foundered pony without saying a word to his mother, and he rode 40 miles through snow to save lives that I did not deserve to save. If you wish to put me in the ground in your yard for the thing I did not do, I would not blame you, sir. Doc, said Silas. Yes, Mr. McCready. Your boy said Silas. What is his name? Thomas, said Hollister, and his voice broke it at last. After my own father, Thomas Hollister. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Doc, there is going to be a wedding at my cabin on the 1st of May. Reverend Whitaker is going to marry me to my wife in the sight of God and of whatever witnesses come up the mountain for the occasion. I would like you to come. I would like Margaret to come. I would like Thomas to come because he is a boy who saved 4 lives, and I would like to shake his hand. After that, we will see about the rest. Doc Hollister put his hat back on his head. He could not for a moment speak. Finally, he said, Mr. McCready, it would be the honor of my life. They rode out of Bitter Creek at 4 in the afternoon. Marshal Walsh and the Pinkerton and Sheriff Thornton and Josiah Blackwood rode south for Cheyenne. Governor Warren rode with them as far as the fork in the road, and then he stopped and he dismounted and he walked back to Abigail's horse and he took off his hat and he said, Mrs. McCready, I owe you an apology from the entire territory of Wyoming. I hope we can be friends. I hope so too, Governor, she said. You are invited to my wedding on the 1st of May. He smiled under the gray beard. Madam, he said, I would not miss it if I had to walk. They came up the mountain in the long blue evening. The 4 of them, plus the Reverend and the dun horse, climbed the last switchback and came up onto the meadow at sunset. And Abigail looked out across the yard at the cabin built into the granite cliff, and at the pine framework of the new room that was almost finished now, and at the birch tree behind the cabin that had 2 small gray stones under it, and she thought for the first time in her life that she had come home. Reverend Josiah Whitaker married Silas McCready to Abigail Prescott. McCready on the 1st of May, 1886, at 2:30 in the afternoon on the porch of the cabin, in the sight of God, and of 47 witnesses who had come up the mountain by every road and track the land offered. Governor Warren was there. Marshal Walsh had come back up from Cheyenne for the occasion. Doc Hollister was there with Margaret and Thomas, and Margaret Hollister stood beside Abigail during the vows holding her bouquet because Abigail had asked her to. Mabel Thornhill was there with her 2 children. The boy with the shoe brush, whose name was Nathaniel Grady, and who would one day many years on marry Abigail's firstborn daughter, was there. The blacksmith was there. Even the clerk from the Blackwood Arms was there because the Blackwood Arms had been sold at federal auction the week before for pennies on the dollar. And the clerk had bought it for $68 and had renamed it the same day the Wind River Hotel. Silas wore the only suit he had ever owned. Abigail wore her mother's traveling dress with the lace collar let out and the hem brought up because she had worn her mother's wedding gown once in a parlor in Boston for a photograph she could no longer find, and she had decided that the Wyoming version of a Prescott bride would wear Wyoming clothes. Ezra gave her away because Silas asked him to, and because Ezra, when asked, had taken 4 seconds to say yes, and then had turned and walked into the barn for 5 minutes before he trusted himself to come back out. Wyatt stood up for Silas. Clara Donovan, the red-haired daughter of an Irish rancher who had come up the trail for the wedding and would within 18 months accept Wyatt's proposal of marriage, under this same birch tree, stood at the edge of the porch and held the Reverend's Bible for him when his hands were full. Reverend Whitaker asked the questions in the old plain language, the way they had been asked in every Methodist meeting house from Ohio to Oregon for 40 years. Silas McCready, he said, will you have this woman to be your wife, and will you promise to love her, comfort her, honor her, and keep her in sickness and in health, in plenty and in want, and forsaking all others, to be faithful to her as long as you both shall live? I will, said Silas, and his voice did not shake. Abigail Prescott, said the Reverend, will you have this man to be your husband? She looked up at him, at the scar on his cheek, at the amber eyes, at the hands at last ungloved and resting one in the other against the front of his black suit. She thought about a letter in a drawer in Boston. She thought about Edelweiss in a stoneware jar. She thought about a window set at the height of her face and an oak table and 3 inches of wood closed by a woman's hand on the 23rd of November. I will, she said clearly, so that Mabel Thornhill could hear her, and Francis Warren could hear her, and Nathaniel Grady, small on the bottom step, could hear her, and her father, if he were listening, could hear her too. I will, and I do. Silas McCready placed a ring on her finger. He had made the ring himself in the barn in February out of a single copper nugget from the vein under the cabin, hammered flat and worked and polished for 11 nights by lamplight. It was not a fine ring. It was the finest ring she had ever seen. He slid it onto her hand, and he covered her hand with his own, and he held it there for a moment. By the power vested in me, said the Reverend Josiah Whitaker, and by the grace of God and the laws of the territory of Wyoming, I pronounce you Silas and Abigail, husband and wife. You may kiss your bride, Mr. McCready. He kissed her on the porch in the sunlight in front of 47 people, and the sound that went up from the meadow was the sound a country makes when it has decided at last to stop being afraid. And that night, when the last of the guests had bedded down in the barn and in the new room, and in tents pitched in the lee of the cliff, and the fire had burned down to its slow red heart, Silas carried his wife over the threshold of the cabin that his own hands had built and closed the door softly behind them. And outside in the meadow, a barred owl was calling, and the last of the spring stars stood clear above the timberline. And when morning came, the world had changed, and the mountain which had held its breath for so long at last released it. The years ran on, as years do. Cordelia Mary McCready was born on the morning of the 18th of June, 1887, in the bedroom that had been the sewing room and was now a nursery, with Ezra and Doc Hollister in attendance, and with Silas sitting on the kitchen floor outside the door with his hands over his face because Ezra had told him firmly that he was not needed in there and was most certainly needed out here. She was named for 2 grandmothers, neither of whom had lived to see a McCready grandchild, and she had her mother's cornflower blue eyes and her father's steady mouth. And when Silas held her for the first time, his hands, which could split firewood all day without trembling, shook so badly that Abigail laughed and cried at the same time. They called her Della. By the time she was 2, she had picked out on her own the birch tree behind the cabin and had started leaving without any instruction from anyone. Little bouquets of wildflowers at the foot of the 2 gray stones there. Silas never said anything about it. He only watched her do it from the kitchen window, and he made Abigail stand beside him while she watched, and neither of them ever explained the birch tree to Della. She seemed to understand, as some children do, that some trees do not need explaining. Theodore William McCready was born in the winter of 1891 on a January night so cold that Ezra's inkwell froze on the kitchen table. He was named for his grandfather, William Theodore Prescott, and he was a quiet baby who grew into a quiet boy, and then into a broad-shouldered, quiet man who took to ranching the way his father had taken to chopping wood, and who at 19 quietly took over the running of the mine without ever being asked because the mine needed running, and Teddy was a McCready. Wyatt married Clara Donovan in the summer of 1889, under the birch tree at the back of the cabin, and Reverend Whittaker, who by then considered himself the family chaplain, came up the mountain for the second wedding as he had come up for the first. Clara bore Wyatt 5 children in the course of 9 years, and every one of them inherited his bright, hard grin, and the cabin, which had been built for 4, grew additions, the way a tree grows rings. Ezra married last. He married a school teacher named Adelaide Whitfield, who had come out from Philadelphia at the request of Abigail to teach at the school. Abigail had founded in Bitter Creek, which by now was called Prescott Academy, and which admitted girls. Ezra courted Adelaide for 3 years with the same patient attention he had given to everything else in his life, leaving small, carved objects on her desk, a wooden hairpin, a whistle shaped like a meadowlark, a tiny box of cedar that smelled like the mountain. When he finally proposed in the spring of 1895, he did it in the kitchen while she was washing dishes, and she turned from the basin with her hands still wet and said, "Ezra McCready, it is about time." They had twin boys 2 years later, Benjamin and Bartholomew, who, true to family precedent, would grow up to become teachers at Prescott Academy themselves. Abigail built her school the first summer she was well enough after Della's birth. It started as a single room behind the church in Bitter Creek with 7 girls and a blackboard Wyatt had made out of a slate they had pulled out of a dry creek bed. By 1890, it had 22 girls. By 1900, it had 47. By 1910, it had 112, and the building had been expanded 3 times. And the town, which had for so long been called Bitter Creek, applied to the Wyoming State Legislature and had its name formally changed to Prescott's Valley by unanimous vote of its citizens in honor of William Theodore Prescott, who had died for a truth his daughter had carried, and of Abigail Prescott McCready, who had taught the town that a woman who walks out of the mud does not forget who watched her fall. Josiah Blackwood was hanged in the federal yard in Cheyenne on the 4th of November, 1886. Gideon Cross was run down by a U.S. Marshal's posse outside of Laramie in the summer of 1886, tried in Cheyenne alongside Blackwood, and sentenced to 25 years in the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth. He died there of pneumonia in the winter of '91. Cole Harding served the 25 years and came out an old man in 1911. He did not return to Wyoming. Doc Ambrose Hollister practiced medicine in Prescott's Valley until his death in the spring of 1915, at which point his practice was taken over by his son Thomas, who had ridden a foundered pony through a snowstorm when he was 14 and had never been the same kind of afraid of anything afterward. Sheriff Elias Thornton made it to Ohio. He wrote one letter 5 years on to Abigail, a short plain letter on lined paper that said, "Only Mrs. McCready, I am well. I have become a schoolmaster in a small town here. I think of you every day. I hope if you can to forgive me. E. Thornton." Abigail wrote him back that same afternoon. Her letter said, "Mr. Thornton, you were forgiven on the porch of my house the day I told you to take that badge to Governor Warren. I am glad to hear that you are teaching. Please write again." They corresponded twice a year at Christmas and at Easter until Thornton's death in 1909, and Abigail kept every one of his letters in a wooden box on her writing desk beside a stoneware jar of dried edelweiss. The mountain held. In the autumn of 1920, Abigail McCready, who was 58 years old and had silver in the honey blonde hair that she still wore in the tight braid of a woman who shoots, stood on the porch of the cabin her husband had built with her hand in his, and watched her grandchildren chase each other through the wildflowers in the meadow below the yard. There were 8 of them at that particular moment. Della's 3 down from Cheyenne for the harvest, a girl and 2 boys. Teddy's too small enough still to ride on Silas's shoulders one at a time. Wyatt and Clara's youngest, a shy red-haired girl named Eileen, who had attached herself to Abigail that summer and would not, it seemed, be pried loose. And Ezra and Adelaide's boys, Benjamin and Bartholomew, now 16, and almost men home from Prescott Academy for the fall break and patiently teaching Eileen how to whistle through a blade of grass. Silas McCready was 68 years old. His beard, which had been dark when Abigail first saw it in the dawn of Bitter Creek, was the color of old snow now, and his hands were slower, and the knee that had taken Admiral Farragut's kick in the summer of '78 gave him trouble in cold weather, and he still, every morning of his life, split the day's kindling at the chopping block by the door before anyone else was awake. He wore a heavy flannel shirt of Ezra's cutting, and his hair, long again, was tied at the nape of his neck with a strip of leather Della had made him at the age of 7. His arm was around his wife's waist in the old way, the way it had been on the porch for 35 years. Abigail had a letter in her free hand. It had come in that afternoon's post brought up by a rider from Prescott's Valley, and she had read it twice and had not yet shown it to Silas. It was from Harriet Jenkins, who was Mabel Thornhill's daughter, who was also 32 years old, who was also the current headmistress of Prescott Academy. Harriet had written in the firm, clean hand she had been taught at the age of 12 by Abigail herself. Mrs. McCready, the letter began. I hope this finds you and Mr. McCready well, and hope also that you will forgive me for writing you at home instead of at the academy. A young woman arrived in town last week on the stage from Butte, Montana. Her name is Miss Helen Porter. She is 19 years old. She has no family. She says she has answered an advertisement for a school teacher in Bitter Creek, which of course has not been called Bitter Creek for 10 years, and which I suppose is why she has come to us, because she found our advertisement in an old paper she was given in a boarding house. I met her at the stage, ma'am. She had been on the road for 4 days. Her bag had been stolen in Bozeman. She had only the dress she arrived in and a small Bible and a copy of Harper's Weekly from the spring of 1916, the one that carried your portrait and the long article about the academy and about what you did in this town in 1885. She asked me, Mrs. McCready, whether the woman in the Harper's article was still alive. I told her that she was, and that she lived up on the mountain with her husband, and that she still came to tea at the academy every Wednesday afternoon. She wept, ma'am. She wept for about 5 minutes, standing in the road beside the stage, and then she said, please, ma'am, please, I have come here because of her. I have come because I thought if I could get to where a woman like that still was, I might remember how to be one. I've put her in the spare room above the kitchen at the academy. She has a fever from the road, but the academy cook has been feeding her broth, and young Doc Hollister has seen her, and she will be well by Monday. I have offered her a position teaching the younger girls. She has accepted. She has asked me very shyly whether it might be possible one day to come up the mountain and meet you. I told her, Mrs. McCready, that I would ask. With love and with respect, as always, I remain your former student, Harriet Jenkins. Abigail read the letter one more time. Then she held it up beside her husband's face so that he could see it without taking her eyes off the grandchildren in the meadow. He read it slowly over her shoulder. He did not speak until he was done. Then quietly he said, well, yes, she said. Silas thought about it. He watched Eileen, his red-haired niece, sit down cross-legged in the grass and put a blade of grass between her thumbs the way Benjamin had shown her. He watched Della's oldest boy chase a butterfly. He watched a pair of ravens turn in the thermal above the meadow. He said, write Harriet back. Tell her yes. Tell her to bring the girl up on the Wednesday after next for tea. Tell her we will set an extra place. Abigail turned her face up to his. There was still color in her cheeks, the quick high color of a woman who had always colored easily, and there were fine white lines around her eyes where the sun had written its signature across 35 years of living, and she was more beautiful to him at 58 than she had been at 23. I love you, Silas McCready, she said. I know, he said. That is a terrible answer. It is the only answer I have ever had. She laughed, low and long, and Della in the meadow heard the laugh and looked up and smiled without knowing why. Abigail folded the letter and put it into the pocket of her apron. She thought for a moment, standing there in the thin gold light of that October afternoon, about the parlor in Boston. She thought about the coach that smelled of tobacco and horse sweat. She thought about the frozen mud of a main street in a town that had decided to watch her die. She thought about 3 amber-eyed riders coming through the blue dawn. She thought about the scallop of a lace curtain stitched crookedly by a man named Ezra. She thought about 3 inches of oak closed by a woman's hand on the 23rd of November, 1885. She thought about a window set at the height of her face in a half-built sewing room and a filed-down Colt and a boning knife falling into the snow. She thought about her father who had carried a man named Thomas McCready out of a place called the Sunken Road with a bullet in his leg, and had never told her in all the years of her childhood that he had done it because men like William Prescott did not tell. She thought that she had come to this mountain with nothing, and that somewhere far away in a room above a kitchen at the academy, a 19-year-old girl named Helen Porter was sleeping off a fever that had come from the road and did not yet know that a letter had been written about her and that a fire had been built for her in a cabin she had not yet seen, and that there was already on the high mountain above Prescott's Valley an extra plate being set at a table that had once been set for four. She leaned against her husband. She watched her grandchildren. She said quietly, "It began on a day like this one, Silas." What had he said? Everything she said, everything that mattered. He pressed his lips to the top of her head just once the way he had pressed his forehead to her braid at the door on a December morning 34 years ago. "I know," he said. And they stood that way together on the porch of the cabin that he had built with his own hands in the cool yellow sunlight of the first Wyoming autumn after the Great War. And below them in the meadow the children laughed, and above them the ravens turned, and somewhere very far away the stage from Butte rolled on toward the morning, and the mountain, the great patient animal that had closed its wings around all of them 35 years before, held them there for one more hour in its keeping. The light began to fade. Silas turned at last toward the door. He said, "Supper." "Supper," she said. She took one last look at the meadow. She called the children in. They came, all 8 of them, at a run toward the cabin and the warm smell of bread coming out of the kitchen, where Adelaide and Clara were already laying out the plates, and the bees barked. And the Mao in the barn called once for oats, and Abigail McCready, the woman who had once been the mail-order bride they had left in the mud, walked into her own house with her husband's hand in hers and closed the door behind her against the coming cold. Outside, the first evening star rose clear above the western ridge. The birch tree behind the cabin held 2 small gray stones at its root, and a third, smaller still, for a little girl named Hannah, who had lived 2 hours on a May morning in '79. And beside the 3 stones, stuck into the soft loam at the base of the trunk, a fresh bouquet of glacier lilies in shooting star put there that morning by Della's 3-year-old, who had learned to do it from watching her mother. 40 years on, from a muddy street in Bitter Creek, on a porch that no longer remembered the word, a woman stood inside her own house with her hand on her husband's, and she thought, as she had thought every autumn evening of her married life, that her father and her father-in-law, whatever they were, wherever they were at peace at last. The mountain held. The promise had been paid. And the door that had been opened by a letter in a drawer in Boston in the spring of 1885 closed gently on the evening of the 19th of October, 1920, against the coming winter, which she knew now and had always known would pass as all winters pass, because winter always ends, because the mountain always holds, and because a man, a good man, always keeps his word.